World War II is now well underway. The Blitzkrieg into France, through the Ardennes, going around the Maginot Line and into the Low Countries. The Nazis have occupied Holland, and as such, they now have control of the territory where Kaiser Wilhelm II lives in exile, having been pushed into resignation to abdicate his throne at the end of World War I. The citizen Prince Wilhelm lives on an allowance given to him, waiting for the day that perhaps he could return to the Reich, waiting for the day that perhaps he could have an active role again. But the years have gone by. He is very elderly. What does the future hold? Now under Nazi occupation in the Low Countries, the Nazis send a new commander to be in charge of the Kaiser's security. The future is even more uncertain. What will the Nazis do with him? Will they try to use him, manipulate him, use him? Will they welcome him back? What is his role? What can be his role? But more importantly, the love story with the commander of the guard and the Jewish girl that works in the house, who turns out to be a British spy there to kill the Kaiser and perhaps even Heinrich Himmler. This is 2016's wonderful film, The Exception. The lovely Lily James, Jai Courtney, Captain Boomerang from the Suicide Squad movies of the DC Universe, and none other than Christopher Plummer. This is an incredible historical film that when you watch something like this, you wonder, why in the world would you do this? Since World War II and the death of the Kaiser, there's been a whole lot of stuff written about this. This is the stuff of historical hypotheses. Could the Kaiser have gotten control of the situation in the Reich? Probably not. Would he ever have been able to pull off a comeback that could have saved us from the worst aspects of National Socialism? Probably not. But there's always going to be these what-if stories, and there's so much scholarly work already out there on the life of the real Kaiser. You have to wonder, when you're making a film set during wartime that's really about the tension of war and ideology on a love story, why did you even do this and set it like this? And yet it's absolutely brilliant. As someone who has studied history and knows more than I probably should about the era of the Kaiser's exile, it works out to be so well done. Of all the oddball things to give correct, reasonable historical examination to, especially 2016 being the date of this film, though 2017, I believe, is its release, in the era of woke, in the era of Trump derangement syndrome, in the era when rice and pancake syrup make you a Nazi and everybody hates them and wants to punch them. It's incredible to do a film set in this time that examines the humanity of the Kaiser, his frailty and his nobility, his weaknesses and his basic wholesome dignity. And those attributes seen also in the commander of the guard, who was a Nazi, albeit a complicated one, in a loving relationship now with a Jewess. Any attempt to make anybody in the ism archaeobia, whatever, into a complex and real human being is usually rejected, especially anytime after 2015 or 2016. And yet this film not only does it, but it does it just geniusly. I can't say well enough, because, there's a ton of movies out there that are set during war, and people fall in love and people on opposite sides. And it's kind of tired, to be honest, and yet our film, The Exception, ends up only kind of being about the love story. No, it really is about, but it all blends together so well with the historical narrative and their interaction and chemistry on screen with one another, that you don't feel like you sat through a sappy romance, because it's not. And you didn't really sit through a war story, but you kind of did. It really isn't an historical period piece, but then it is. And in all of these aspects, it makes it really hard to define. Our young officer, played by Jai Courtney, has been on the Eastern Front. He had been in the Blitzkrieg of Poland. He has seen the SS mow down civilian women and children, and he was outraged, and he beat the commander of that group up, beat him to a tar. Only because of his well-placed connections, we learn that he is sort of a distant relative of General Ludendorff from back in the day. I mean, World War II fame, an epic name. Only that keeps him out of the concentration camps, possibly, or at least being put against the wall and shot as other members or as members of the SS reference in our film. But he was terribly wounded on the Eastern Front with shrapnel that's still in his body. He becomes the logical choice to be this bodyguard at a house, keeping an eye on the Kaiser. The Nazis are suspicious of the Kaiser and his connections. They don't want the monarchy attempting to restore itself. They certainly are not intending to restore the monarchy at any detriment of their own power. But there is that lingering question still, being that the movement is kind of sort of conservative, kind of sort of traditional in this weird amorphous way. Will they try to bring back the Kaiser as their puppet, their stooge, even if he's what Queen Elizabeth would become in England, and just cut ribbons? What exactly is the dynamic? So we get Jai Courtney sent to be in charge of the Kaiser, keep an eye on him, monitor his opinions for the SS, be very careful what he is discussed in front of him, and very quickly he decides to partake of a nice looking young servant girl that works in the Kaiser's house, ordering her in this very stereotypically Nazi fashion when they're alone to take off her clothing. And he has his way with her, but she does say, "Be gentle." It's a very bizarrely abusive rape sort of moment in any sort of hashtag Me Too era. And yet you can tell there's more going on, and it is more complex than most anybody would have the guts to portray it. And yet it gets portrayed as complex. Later on, she comes to his quarters and commands him to take his clothing off. In this weird turn of events, the tables turned. Obviously, he doesn't have to do it. Obviously, he does. They end up in this weird, almost unnatural kind of courtship where these people push together who are lonely, who are desperate, who are living in these circumstances where war, and in her case, her espionage, could at any moment cause her death. They act out, but they find one another, and they begin to see each other as more than the stereotype of him being a Nazi. And finally, she does tell him that she is a Jew, to which he wants to protect her. He's sort of a classic German psyche of 1941, which again, in our era is politically incorrect to say, and has been for a long time. He's a patriotic German who looks forward to German victory. He attacked the Gestapo guy because he does not believe that those things are German. He does not believe that the SS are like that. That is a disgrace and that is a shame, he says to all decent Germans. Finally, his Jewish girlfriend has to tell him that is not the exception. That is the rule, and hence the title of the film, which you think when you read the synopsis or watch the trailer and you go into it, she's an exception. He's a Nazi, and he's going to try to rationalize that having a relationship with this Jewish woman is an exception somehow. But that's really not the whole point of the title and how it works into the film. Over time, he becomes aware of his sympathies with the Kaiser as a human being. And of course, this isn't surprising because Jai Courtney's character has been on the Eastern Front and even in war sympathized with human beings. He's a human who's more than willing to be at war for something that justifies being at war, but is treated as an honorable person forced to be at war for their ideals, not as a monster trying to remake the world through force and fear. So he becomes increasingly aware that the SS, well, he already didn't like them, increasingly aware as Himmler arrives that they're going to use the Kaiser, manipulate him, lie to him about being restored in some fashion in an attempt to out any restorationists who want the Kaiser back. In the meantime, our spy has discovered that Himmler is coming, and she sees the opportunity to kill Himmler. Of all the people that are a target, the elderly Kaiser living in exile may or may not be worthwhile to take out if the Nazis are going to use him for propaganda. But Himmler, how can you pass on getting Heinrich Himmler? The propaganda victory alone, notwithstanding what he commands and what he's in charge of and is arguably directly guilty for. So as our plot sort of unravels, the Gestapo becomes closer to finding out she's a spy. Our Nazi Wehrmacht guard is going out of his way to protect his lover and hide the weapons. It's really sort of, this is just amazing stuff. In the end, we get a nice tale of escape. He helps her to escape. She's able to get to freedom. Ultimately, he's back in Berlin, predictably at a desk job by the end of the war because of the shrapnel. There's a bombing raid. He gets a package from the Red Cross. It's a book that is clearly a coded message from her. Fade out to her, living in exile in England. He had promised that if they survived the war, that they would get married. And we see her living in England, and she stands up, and we realize that she is pregnant. The real highlight of this whole thing, there's a couple. One is you can't beat Christopher Plummer as an actor in any era of his life, but he does the Kaiser well. He does not play up the Kaiser to be villainous or he doesn't do it in an overly negative way. He also doesn't portray the Kaiser as greater than human. He's not perfect. He portrays a Kaiser that has got all these good redeemable qualities, but is also very much in denial of his own mistakes and errors and really the guilt that he shares for the interwar period as well as the First World War, and really then the failure of that war and that campaign that leads inevitably to World War II, to the Nazi movement. Arguably, he shares in the guilt of anything that's going to come upon his people because of the failure of his leadership, because of the failure of the First World War. And we get a man that is very much in denial about that, at least up front, still wanting to blame everyone else for stabbing him in the back, protesting that he didn't want it that way, although he clearly could have done something else if he didn't want some of it to develop that way, which comes out in the plot. But we also get a man that profoundly believes in his place in history under God. He's devoutly Christian. He's forgiving. He's loving. When he finds out that the guard is having a relationship with the maid, he covers for them and says, I made mistakes too. He has some of the most hilarious lines in the movie when he talks about his life, admits his wrongdoings in his personal life. It's really good stuff. One of the highlights of this film has got to be, it's the Kaiser, a lot like I imagined him from history, but played so well that I'm more fond of him now. Kind of the way HBO's Rome did with Mark Antony. I liked him better. Having seen him on screen, played well. The Kaiser, Christopher Plummer, this is great stuff. But also, oddly enough, the love story. The love story comes out without being overly melodramatic or sappy, and yet these people connect on this level that he knows he's got to stay and fight for his Germany, even though there are forces that he knows now are working to make it not his Germany or what he believes in. She gets to freedom, and ultimately they come back together, and there's sort of this healing of the history of the suffering of his family, the suffering of her family, the gift of new life in her womb that is going to be the child of this. And again, the amazingness that we were able to get this film and that it is so good and well done. And these people are so human, and it would be a hard sell to a lot of places today because of the weird, random screaming and accusing people of being Nazis that goes on, and the dehumanization then that is inherent in that. And it's really, really amazing to see these two people on film portrayed so well, so human. You care about them. You want them together at the end. It's really profound. I can't say enough good stuff about it. Check it out. It is out there on Amazon Prime. Let me know what you think. 2017-16, The Exception.